Η πόλη είναι θέατρο αλλαγών και καινοτομιών, έδρας εξουσίας και χωνευτήρια πολιτισμού.
A city is like a kind of a dream catcher.
Εδώ άνθρωποι διαφορετικοί μεταξύ τους μετακινούνται, επικοινωνούν και συναγωνίζονται.
Our capital cities are really distinct and memorable places where people come together to live the good life.
Ως το 2050, το 68% του πληθυσμού της γης θα ζει σε πόλεις που ήδη βρίσκονται στα όρια τους ή θα μετακομίσει σε άλλες που ακόμα δεν έχουν σχεδιαστεί.
One of the problems with any city that has a thriving economy is that there is constant pressure for change, pressure for development.
And cities have just ballooned in size over the 20th century.
Ποτέ πριν δεν ήταν τόσο επιτακτική ανάγκη να δημιουργηθούν βιώσιμες πόλεις που θα αποτελούν πηγή έμπνευσης και ενθουσιασμού.
We're not only building high, we're also building wide. It's not just a question of density, it's a question of urbanity. Why can't we make new cities in Australia? We're the only country with a whole continent.
Καθώς κινούμαστε ολοταχώς προς ένα περισσότερο αστικό μέλλον, είναι πολλά αυτά που έχουμε να μάθουμε από το παρόν και το παρελθόν, αλλά και για τον τρόπο που μπορούμε να κατασκευάσουμε τις καλύτερες πόλεις στον κόσμο.
Oh my God, this place, it's so sexy.
It's exciting, it's diverse, kind of a cross between a high-class hooker and a country matron.
I love the history of Sydney. I mean, the harbour's great. But what I love about Sydney is, what I think of as its ancient, messed up, crooked little heart. So you get all these convicts who came here with no education and no skills and no money and no sense of a future. They had a whole continent to play with. And what do? They build these kind of squashed up little streets and squashed up little houses and squashed up little lives because they were desperate to get back into the huddle of deprivation that they were used to. And I think that is so charming. I just think the pathos of that is so touching and so sweet and so kind of funny in a sad way.
Sydney is the biggest city in Australia. Before Queen Victoria's day, Sydney hardly existed at all. Yet today, 1 out of every 5 Australians comes from here.
Σίδνεϊ. Μια πόλη του κόσμου που κινείται με τους δικούς της ρυθμούς. Η καρδιά της είναι αυτό το εκπληκτικό λιμάνι των 55 τετραγωνικών χιλιόμετρων. Η ψυχή της είναι τα 5,3 εκατομμύρια κατοίκων που έχουν την τύχη να ζουν στην ευρύτερη περιοχή του Σίδνεϊ.
Sydney was established as a penal settlement, as a place to send convicted criminals from England. They were sent to Australia as a means of hardship.
It's a unique story to Sydney. It actually puts down roots into the story of the city.
Με το βλέμμα στραμμένο προς τα έξω και τη σκέψη στο μέλλον, αν και δέσμια του παρελθόντος της, η πόλη του Σίδνεϊ ολοένα εξελίσσεται. Επαναπροσδιορίζεται συνεχώς, αγνώντας όλους τους κανόνες και κολυμπώντας συχνά κόντρα στο κύμα.
Most people think about Sydney and they probably think about convicts. But of course, Sydney's history goes back much further. I like to say that Sydney is a modern city with an ancient heartbeat. And that heartbeat is Aboriginal people.
Historically, if you go back, there's evidence of Aboriginal populations in Sydney for around 30,000 years.
Δεν γνωρίζουμε πόσοι Αβορίγινες ζούσαν στην ευρύτερη περιοχή του Σίδνεϊ την εποχή της Βρετανικής εισβολής, δεδομένου ότι πολλοί αφανίστηκαν από τους απίκους ή από την ευλογιά που έφεραν μαζί τους πριν γίνει απογραφή. Οι ιστορικοί τους υπολογίζουν σε χιλιάδες.
Circular Quays seemed to be a place where they came together. And it was an obvious place for the Europeans to settle. Why was that? Because it had fresh water, it had the Tank Stream. It was a bay that faced north, it received the sea breeze. It had shores that went down quite deep so that ships could moor quite near the shore, but a sandy bed.
The Tank Stream, which you don't even know is there, it's like the secret river, which runs from the town hall underground all the way down to the quay, which is really beautiful.
It was this nirvana in a sense, and it was well appreciated by the Indigenous people and instantly seen by Governor Phillip when he arrived here as a perfect place for settlement.
What we see is water really directing where the settlement establishes, where the penal colony goes. We quickly see that alongside this place of punishment, we get a maritime port developing. And so there's whaling and there is sealing, and they're critical industries for Sydney in its very early days.
Είχαν εκπονηθεί σχέδια για την πόλη το 1788. Τα περισσότερα όμως ήταν ακατάλληλα λόγω του εδάφους και της επιτακτικής ανάγκης για τη δημιουργία καταβλισμού για τους 850 περίπου κατάδικους, τους δεσμοφύλακες και τους αξιωματικούς που τους επιτηρούσαν.
I think it's fair to say that Sydney can be regarded in many ways an accidental city right up until the late 19th century. And we can see that in the way the streets respond a lot more to the topography rather than any sort of formal grid line.
And that's been a big thing in Sydney's development, is the relation of the city grids to the very strong underlying topography.
A lot of the roads developed from early paths. George Street and Pitt Street and Elizabeth Street, that's why they all sort of diverged.
Forest Road and Oxford Street follow the ridge. They're almost certainly Aboriginal tracks.
Even the route from Sydney to Parramatta basically follows the line of what was very likely to have been a route that the Indigenous people took from Sydney to Parramatta, because it was essentially along a ridge, parallel to the water.
Those early plans of Sydney show convicts on the left, on the west, and the redcoats and the governor on the right. And that's still western suburbs and eastern suburbs. Still a class line that's drawn, and they're sort of divided by the tank stream.
Most of the early settlement was up on the western side of what is now Circular Quay, up in the rocks.
Of course, it's called the Rocks because it had rock.
A lot of Sydney's buildings are built out of sandstone. They're built out of country. It gives a certain colour to the city. It has a gorgeous yellow colour that honeys over time and really glows in the Sydney sunlight.
It's a geological specificity of Sydney, and it's given the whole city so much character.
We can look at those marks on the Argyle cut, which the convicts made with their, rock hammers or whatever they were using. And you can think, oh my God, look at this. That would have taken how long? Months, years, pain, misery. And so that sense of empathy to have been you, back 200 years ago, I can feel that. And that's good for us. It makes us better people.
One of the really interesting things about many convicts in Sydney is that while there were some gangs and leg irons and all of that, there were also a lot of convicts that were just assigned to be servants, to be assigned to masters to help them with their businesses. And once they'd done the hours required of them, they could then go and work on their own business. They could grow their own vegetables and sell them if they wanted. And they started building their own little huts and started creating their own businesses.
Παρά τις διαρκείς παρεμβάσεις του Λονδίνου, η πόλη αναπτύχθηκε από μόνη της.
The city of Sydney is formed in 1842. The colonial government decides that it's worthwhile to push off some of the more difficult nitty-gritty things like dealing with rubbish and dealing with roads and trying to provide sanitation for the town. And so they introduce municipal government. The first elections happen at a local government level. And a council of worthy men and even a couple of former convicts come around and form the first council, and they have to literally try to work out how to deal with everything that a growing city needs.
Ο σχεδιασμός υποδομών είναι πολύπλοκο ζήτημα για κάθε δημοτικό συμβούλιο. Στο Σίδνεϊ όμως παρά ήταν προβληματικός.
Being halfway around the world and trying to set up manufacturing to actually support the building of infrastructure, all these sort of things really challenged the early colonists and the municipal council. So one of the key things that the council had to do right at the very start was to deal with sanitation, so sewerage and water.
So the history of sewage starts pretty much where the history of drinking water starts, the tank stream. In order to make that supply more reliable, they actually dug rectangular tanks into the sandstone to store water. The tank stream became an unofficial sewer by the 1830s. It was an official sewer when we first built our first formal sewage systems in the late 1850s. And those sewers just discharged raw, untreated wastewater straight into Sydney Harbour. Towards the end of the 1800s, we developed what was called the Botany Sewage Farm. And then later on came the Bondi sewage system, which is what drained a lot of the city's wastewater. So instead of discharging that raw sewage into Sydney Harbour, we were discharging it off a cliff face at Bondi.
Ο κακός ωστόσο αρχικός σχεδιασμός του αποχετευτικού συστήματος οχριά μπροστά στο σύστημα διανομής του νερού σε όλη την αποικία.
Some of the first pipes that were laid in Sydney were actually lead pipes, which of course we now know for drinking water is not such a good idea, can lead to lead poisoning.
Το πρώτο συμβούλιο διαλύθηκε μετά από μια δεκαετία. Το επόμενο προσπάθησε να μην επαναλάβει τα ίδια λάθη. Ζήτησε να γίνει μια έρευνα για να έχει περισσότερα στοιχεία για την ανάπτυξη της πόλης.
This trigonometrical survey of Sydney went from 1855 through to 1865, and it's our first accurate survey of Sydney. And we can see where the water pipes were going, where the drainage was happening. And this is the very start of, I guess, rather than being haphazard planning, but actually starting to really plan our infrastructure for Sydney.
Η εντολή για την έρευνα ήρθε την κατάλληλη στιγμή, καθώς άλλαζε η τύχη της πόλης, φέρνοντας σημαντική αύξηση του πληθυσμού της.
If we go through the decades, 1840s, we've got end of transportation, we've got a depression. The 1850s, we see gold being discovered in New South Wales. And so that really brings a big influx of population in and also money into the colony. Through the 1860s, we actually start to see the start of an economic boom. And that lasts through until the 1890s. And so we see Sydney growing and transforming from being a penal colony to going into a Georgian town and then really blossoming into what we call the Victorian period. And it really shines out that Sydney at that time was the port of the south.
Australia's tramway system started back in 1861. Even when the horses lost a shoe or two, the passengers still arrived on time.
Οι δημόσιες συγκοινωνίες ήταν άλλος ένας εφιάλτης που έπρεπε να αντιμετωπιστεί. Το μαύρο πρόβατο στις υποδομές που στοίχιωνε κι όλες τις επόμενες γενιές.
There's a transport plan through to 2056. It's far too weak. It's completely lacks ambition, and we need to be building public transport on a scale that's 3 and 4 times that envisaged in that plan. We need lots of modes.
Σήμερα, 813 χιλιόμετρα του υβριδικού συστήματος σιδηροδρόμων συνδέουν την πόλη με τα περίχωρα με 8 γραμμές, 175 σταθμούς και αριθμό επιβατών που ξεπερνά τα 413 εκατομμύρια το χρόνο. Πρόσφατη επέκταση πρόσθεσε ακόμα 3 γραμμές και 42 σταθμούς.
It's great we've got a metro, it's great that we've got light rail, but we need to use them with heavy rail above and buses and then pedestrians and cycling. We need an integration of them in a way that we used to do very well. Sydney actually was a great public transport city, and so up to the construction of the Harbour Bridge, we had one of the biggest tram systems in the world. We had a railway system with very high patronage, we had ferries that were booming, and we had interchange between them all. So we had a walking city that intersected with a public transport city.
Τα δημόσια μέσα μεταφοράς στην πόλη κινούνται σε άξονες. Οι σιδηροδρομικές γραμμές επέκτηναν το ακτινωτό σχέδιο των παλαιών οδών και πάνω σε αυτό ακολούθησαν γραμμές τρένου και τραμ. Καρδιά ολόκληρου του συστήματος σιδηροδρόμων είναι ο κεντρικός σταθμός όπου κατελήγουν και τα τελευταία 12 χιλιόμετρα της σιδηροδρομικής γραμμής που συνδέει την κυκλική αποβάθρα με το Randwick.
Well, there's lots of challenges because they ran running it up George Street. It's the oldest urban street in Australia, so it was full of surprises.
Central Railway Station was actually built on one of Sydney's early cemeteries, the Devonshire Street cemeteries. That was in use from 1820 through to the 1860s. The government did clear it, but what we discover is that the bodies keep popping up, and they came up again during the most recent infrastructure works around Central Station.
When Sydney's last tram made its last journey through the city, Aussies gave it a great farewell. They packed themselves on board and they lined the route, so the tram had a rattling good send-off. Business was brisker than it had been for years. But trams are now a thing of the past. In 1961, it's the age of speed, so get a move on, Sydney!
There are people living in Sydney who can remember being on trams, and it just made perfect sense back then to get rid of them to make room for cars, and now it makes perfect sense to get rid of cars and put light rail in.
Light rail is different than tram, basically in terms of the scale. Running on track that's the same gauge, they're running with the same kind of overhead or in-ground wires, and it's just that trams had an old-fashioned ring to it, and light rail sounded modern back in the 1970s and 80s when people coined the word. It has exclusive right-of-way in most places, but it crosses at grade, which means that it has to stop at traffic signals. And when it's running up George Street, it's in a pedestrian zone, so it runs slower because there's a lot of pedestrians about. This idea of the light rail running down George Street is a bit oversized, really. And if you look at the old pictures of George Street, there'd be trams running down George Street, but they'd be much smaller vehicles, and there'd be many more of them. It'd be much more frequent.
Και ενώ οι παλιές γραμμές του τρένου και του τραμ επεκτείνονται, η πόλη αναπτύσσεται πέρα από τον αστικό της πυρήνα.
These suburbs start developing up around certain train stations and also along the tram lines. So Newtown really flourishes. Petersham really flourishes in the late 19th century and into the earlier 20th century. And supported by this infrastructure development, municipal government broadens out.
If you look at the city centre, if you came here in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, it was predominantly terrace houses. Don't have that many grander rows of terraces. We tend to have smaller terraces. Of course, we've added the verandas. They're very efficient terraces. Developers and builders in the 19th century loved them because you could just pack them in, make them narrower.
Verandas were never a big thing in England, but they become so much more important in Australia to reduce heat, create outdoor living areas, that type of thing.
And so by the early 20th century, Sydney really is a city of suburbs. And there are growing little local areas and individual councils and businesses all happening in the suburbs, but still this really strong transport network that comes back to the centre of the city.
Στις αρχές του 1900, τα ferry boat ήταν το πιο κατάλληλο μέσο για να πάει κανείς από τη βόρεια πλευρά του λιμανιού στη νότια. Όλα αυτά όμως θα άλλαζαν με την κατασκευή της γέφυρας στο λιμάνι του Σίδνεϊ.
So the bridge was this great project that was talked about for centuries.
There are fantastic drawings in the State Library of early tunnels proposed, many bridge forms proposed, and it's only until enough political pressure and enough money's available to be able to build the harbour bridge.
Our Treasury argued against the bridge for decades, just like they argue against all sorts of sensible infrastructure today.
Η κυβέρνηση ανέλαβε το επίπονο έργο, ενέκρινε το σχέδιο και έδωσε το πράσινο φως για την κατασκευή της.
It used local skills but also brought in some technology from overseas.
Building commenced in 1925, so right in the middle of the roaring 20s. But Sydney, like so many other cities around the world, got caught up in the Great Depression. There was high unemployment, especially in the inner city working class. The building of the harbour bridge continues despite the depression and in fact becomes this real symbol of hope for Sydney. And it was completed in 1932 and is considered an extraordinary engineering feat.
This colossal structure will stand as a monument to British engineering skill and courage.
Συνολικά απασχολήθηκαν 1.400 εργάτες, ενώ 16 από αυτούς έχασαν τη ζωή τους κατά τη διάρκεια των εργασιών.
Completely changed the scale of the city, both physically and in terms of skyline.
The bridge was massive and was the widest bridge ever at the time. This enormous structure that was built well in advance of demand.
It's one of the great bridges built in any city in the world. Remarkable public work.
The intricate and massive web of steel conveys some impression of the immensity of this all-British engineering feat. Sydney Bridge, like Sydney Harbour, is one of the marvels of the universe.
The opening in 1932 must have been a fantastic time for everyone, at least in Sydney and probably New South Wales, because it was very much a day of celebration, a moment of joy, and it's such a big achievement for something of that scale to have been built.
During that first hour, 200,000 people crossed the bridge, a record that remains unbroken to this day. Nowadays, people don't walk over the bridge, they drive across at much the same speed and pay for the privilege. That's really money for jam.
Με 49 μέτρα πλάτος και 1.149 μέτρα μήκος, είναι η μεγαλύτερη γέφυρα από ατσάλι σε όλο τον κόσμο. Για τη συναρμολόγησή της χρειάστηκαν 6 εκατομμύρια πριτσίνια, όλα τοποθετημένα με το χέρι.
It originally had 2 lanes of trams that were meant to be the Northern Beaches railway line. It's got 6 lanes of traffic, then has what's now a cycleway on one side and a pedestrian way on the other.
Τα 13,5 εκατομμύρια δολάρια κόστος υπερέβαιναν κατά πολύ τις δυνατότητες του δημοσίου και έτσι μπήκαν διόδια. 6 πένες ή 5 cents για ένα αυτοκίνητο και 3 πένες ή 2 cents για ένα άλογο. Η αποπληρωμή ολοκληρώθηκε το 1988, αλλά το σύστημα των διοδίων παραμένει, αποφέροντας περίπου 80 εκατομμύρια δολάρια Αυστραλίας το χρόνο. Με αυτά πλήρωσαν τη συντήρηση, αλλά και τη σύραγγα που περνά τώρα κάτω από το λιμάνι του Σίδνεϊ. Απαραίτητη προσθήκη στο δικό δίκτυο της πόλης, καθώς πληθυσμός και αυτοκίνητα αυξάνονται συνεχώς.
Each year, more and bigger cars swell the ranks of the procession that daily snakes its way to and from the city at peak hours. Expressways certainly help after the bridge has been negotiated, but perish the thought, it appears the only real solution to Sydney's problem is another bridge.
What did the governments in the post-war era invest in? It was the Holden. It wasn't railways or the like. And the more roads you build, the more cars you will have. No city in the world has ever solved the car problem by building more motorways. All they've done is generate more congestion.
There's a quote, I think this is Lewis Mumford, solving congestion by widening roads is like solving obesity by loosening your belt. You're not solving obesity, you're accommodating increased growth.
Σήμερα περίπου το 1/3 του αστικού ιστού καλύπτεται από δρόμους και χώρους στάθμευσης, ενώ προστίθενται περισσότεροι αυτοκινητόδρομοι και λωρίδες κυκλοφορίας κάθε χρόνο, παρά το ότι παγκοσμίως αποφεύγεται πλέον η χρήση ιδιωτικών αυτοκινήτων μέσα στις πόλεις.
Cars are sort of antisocial beasts and they're not good for our health. People get more aggressive in their cars. They simply just take so much room as well as noise, pollution, congestion, all those space.
We have a planning department and lots and lots of people are employed and they make lots of plans and they make no difference to anything. Even in cabinet, planning doesn't take any precedence because there's also a minister for roads and a minister for transport. And of course that's where all the money goes. And so where the money goes is where the power is. You do the roads and it's like, oh, you had a plan? Oh, sorry. That's really nice that you've got a plan, but that can sit on the shelf. We're just going to put this motorway in, okay?
Το West Connex είναι ένα πρόγραμμα 16,8 εκατομμυρίων δολαρίων. Ένας αυτοκινητόδρομος 33 χιλιόμετρων που συνδέει δυτικό και νότιο-δυτικό Σίδνεϊ με το κέντρο της πόλης, το αεροδρόμιο και την περιοχή του Port Botany. Οι υποστηρικτές του προγράμματος προτείνουν να αφαιρεθούν 52 φανάρια στη διαδρομή μεταξύ της περιοχής Παραμάτα και του κέντρου της πόλης για να μειωθεί ο χρόνος της διαδρομής από την περιοχή Παραμάτα προς το αεροδρόμιο του Σίδνεϊ κατά 40 λεπτά. Οι επικριτές όμως το θεωρούν περιττό και τεράστια απώλεια χρημάτων.
you know, the biggest motorway project in the history of this country. About, 15 years after we know that we don't want to do any more fossil fuels and we know that climate change is happening and this is a real thing. But no, we're still building, 10-lane and sort of 12-lane motorways, knocking down heritage suburbs. I think that's disastrous. I think that's really, really ill-advised. And even 20 years ago, places like Berlin and San Francisco were knocking down motorways and putting up housing instead, public housing quite often. And we're still doing the opposite, So I think that's disastrous. There are lots of ways of doing density, and I think we do it badly. Places like Berlin and Paris are better at doing it than we are, and that's partly because they don't just say to developers, whatever you like.
Όσο παράνομο κι αν φαίνεται, οχριά μπροστά σε ό,τι συνέβαινε στα τέλη των δεκαετιών 1950-60, αλλά και αρχές της δεκαετίας του 70.
It was a complete snake pit, full of corrupt and nepotistic government, fantastically wild and self-interested.
Today, even more dramatic changes are taking place as many of the old landmarks and the not-so-old make way for new developments to match the city's economic progress.
There was a lot of damage. It led to the Heritage Act and the whole idea of heritage in the city, but we'd already lost a lot in those two or three decades.
Το παλιό δίνει τη θέση του στο νέο, αγνώντας κάπως την ιστορία. Ολόκληρα τμήματα της πόλης και των προαστίων της χάνουν την ταυτότητά τους. Μέσα σε αυτή την τρέλα, ένα κτίσμα που θα επαναπροσδιόριζε μια ολόκληρη περιοχή αρχίζει να παίρνει σάρκα και οστά.
This is the most controversial building in Australia and probably in the world. An adventure in design and construction, it has set a new precedent that's not only restricted to architecture. It must be the biggest budget beater ever built.
Το μοναδικό κτίριο της όπερας του Σίδνεϊ.
I love Sydney Opera House. Just love it. It's one of my favourite places to go to. I can't imagine Sydney without it. You come from Circular Quay, you walk around the bay, and then there's this majestic sculpture there in front of you.
It's so recognisable and it's become so Sydney, although isn't it funny that it was designed and made almost completely by foreigners, given how much we regard it as ours.
And I think Sydney also probably likes that because it shows that we have links to the outside world. We're comfortable sitting in the context of an international setting.
Με μια οικονομία να αναπτύσσεται ταχύτατα χάρη στη συνεχή προσέλευση Ευρωπαίων μεταναστών, η Αυστραλία αναζητά τρόπο για να εκφράσει την πολιτιστική της αφύπνιση, την αισιοδοξία, αλλά και τη μεταμόρφωσή της.
It all began in the 1950s, with designers from around the world competing for one of the prizes of the century. The winning entry was the creation of Danish architect Jørn Utzon.
Utzon was this tall, enlightened, educated, naive Scandinavian bowling into Sydney as if this was a civilised place, which it actually wasn't at all. So he's like this refined dude thinking, I've won this competition, now all we have to do is build it.
He presented these fantastic drawings and had this amazing vision.
But then, of course, it proved to be impossible to build.
Το σχέδιο του Ούτσον ήταν πολύ προχωρημένο και προς μεγάλη του λύπη έπρεπε να αλλάξει ριζικά.
Ove Arup, the very famous engineer, was very involved, and he actually helped Utzon come to the conclusion of how it should be built.
Over the years, there have been alterations to the original concept, but the basic idea of white sails floating on the harbour remains.
His original scheme, the shells were much flatter. Later on, they became segments of a sphere as a means of working out how to build it.
Για να διορθωθούν τα πανιά στο κτίριο της όπερας, έπρεπε να γίνει μια σειρά αλλαγών. Προέκυψε όμως πολύ σύντομα ένα πολύ πιο σύνθετο πρόβλημα. Για να επιταχυνθεί το πρόγραμμα, έγιναν μάλλον υποθέσεις σχετικά με τη σύσταση του εδάφους της περιοχής παρά σοβαρή μελέτη. Έπρεπε να αναθεωρηθεί ο τρόπος κατασκευής των θεμελίων του κτηρίου στο προσχωσιγενές έδαφος. Αυτές οι εργασίες όμως δεν είχαν προβλεφθεί, με αποτέλεσμα να σημειωθεί μια τεράστια υπέρβαση χρόνου και χρημάτων.
All sorts of problems in the process, took a lot longer to build. when you don't know how something's going to be built, it's difficult to be able to budget for it.
When work started, the estimated cost of Sydney's new opera house was £3.5 million. After only 1 year, it was £5 million. By 1964, the £12.5 million had escalated to £17.5. Now, almost 2 years later, they're talking in terms of a final cost of an astronomical £30 million. Some price to pay for culture.
Κάθε βήμα διαρκούσε περισσότερο. Κάθε στοιχείο αποδεικνυόταν ακριβότερο. Ακόμα και το φινίρισμα στα κεραμίδια χρειάστηκε 3 χρόνια για να τελειώσει και ατέλειωτες ώρες για να φτιαχτούν και να στρωθούν. 1.056.006 κεραμίδια σε 26 διαφορετικές στρώσεις.
Those cynics who said this bird would never fly had to eat their words, as month by month the sails rose higher to reach the sun.
Η μεταμόρφωση της όπερας ολοκληρώθηκε και άνοιξε τις πύλες της το 1973 με μια τεράστια υπέρβαση του προϋπολογισμού κατά 1.438%.
Close up with those great bits of concrete where the shells come down to the ground and those huge curved beams, and you know that they're diving into the ground and being tied underneath. And the concrete is so muscular and so fabulous. It's this kind of giant creature. So, yeah, it's impossible not to love it.
Sydney gets more like New York every day. Her latest skyscraper is to be the most modern of its kind in the southern hemisphere. Built to the maximum permissible height, it goes up 150 feet, a massive framework of steel.
Όσο κατασκευαζόταν η όπερα, άλλο ένα κτίριο κτιζόταν σε χρόνο ρεκόρ, το συγκρότημα Square Tower.
As Sydney began to grow, buildings began to get taller. Australia Square was designed by a very interesting architect, Harry Seidler, who was, for a long time, was probably Australia's most famous architect.
It's a real pivot from old Sydney to modern Sydney. They lobbied to get the height limit removed, the 150-foot height limit, replaced with what's called a floor space ratio. So if your site was 100 square metres, you could have 1,200 square metres, but in any shape. So it could be 50 stories high, but very thin. And so for the first time, that sort of incredible glittering harbour became a commodity. Sydney's whole centre of gravity shifted from being down near Central Station, where the shopping centre had been and all of the department stores had been, to being downtown, because that's where workers would be and that's where you could sell floor space. So that's where all the prime money was going to be in the future.
In Sydney in the 1960s, the early towers were government towers. And so Australia Square was the exemplar of the private speculative tower.
It applied a very modernist approach, not only to the design of the office building, but also to the public spaces around it.
30 κτίρια κατεδαφίστηκαν για την κατασκευή του συγκροτήματος, που συνδύαζε αριστοτεχνικά δημόσιο χώρο και ιδιωτικά γραφεία, τέχνη και λιανεμπόριο, με ένα κυλινδρικό πύργο και ένα πρωτοποριακό περιστρεφόμενο εστιατόριο. Και αυτό κάλυπτε μόλις το 25% της έκτασης.
It's the high spot of the changing skyline of Sydney, Australia. 50 stories and 600 feet high, it's been built in record time at the rate of a new story every week.
Εκείνη την εποχή, το Square Tower ήταν το ψηλότερο κτίριο από ελαφρύ σκυρόδεμα σε όλο τον κόσμο. Μια εντελώς νέα τεχνική κατασκευής. Χρησιμοποιούσε ένα μοναδικό δομικό σύστημα που αναπτύχθηκε σε συνεργασία με τον Pierluigi Nervi, έναν από τους κορυφαίους μηχανικούς της εποχής του, που θα δημιουργούσε τους ιδιαίτερα δημοφιλείς σήμερα κονικούς ουρανοξύστες.
I think that in a sense the 60s was an aberration in terms of claiming the city as a business district because it's actually the city centre for everybody. In 1900 the city was full of people living in it, and in the post-war period the city was voided of its residential population. Now there's a much healthier mix of residential with office and all other things in the city centre.
So you're living basically in mansions in the sky in some places.
Everyone says, well, every Australian would prefer to live in a house. That's clearly not true.
When I left Britain, 65% of people were living in council housing, what we call housing commission. You come to Australia, you can buy the mythical quarter-acre block. You can have your own house, and it was the dream. for a lot of people. But the city had to spread further and further out to accommodate all these quarter-acre blocks.
Όσο απομακρύνεται κανείς από το κέντρο της πόλης, τόσο μεγαλύτερες αποστάσεις διανύει. Έτσι, πολλοί αποφασίζουν να εγκατασταθούν κάπου πιο κεντρικά για να έχουν ένα πιο κοινωνικό τρόπο διαβίωσης.
Close to services, close to transport, close to jobs, close to entertainment options and shopping and the like. They prefer the view to the garden and, perhaps the sociability of the apartment as opposed to the sociability of the suburban street.
Apartments are often seen as breaking up communities, overshadowing old houses and things. But in some ways, they're actually keeping communities together. Some people go into apartments to be part of a community, and some people go into apartments for anonymity. And the remarkable thing about it is you can have both. If you choose not to talk to your neighbours in the lift, they will get the message very quickly. But, if you're chatty, and other people are, the conversation starts on the 12th floor and keeps going out into the street. You really get that sense of the vertical village that they talk about.
While the old city buildings are virtually disappearing overnight to be replaced by new ones, the population is exploding too, heading for a figure of 5 million by the turn of the century.
Πολλά οικοδομικά τετράγωνα κατεδαφίστηκαν για να κατασκευαστούν οικιστικοί πύργοι. Άλλες περιοχές αναβαθμίστηκαν και έγιναν προσιτές μόνο στους πολύ εύρωστους οικονομικά.
During the 60s and 70s, people were buying into those areas because they were cheap. I remember my father telling me when he was growing up that Paddington was essentially a slum.
Kind of on the fringes of the city. It's lots of windy, twisty little laneways that were deemed to be very inconvenient 35 years ago, but are now seen to be charming, and they slow the traffic down, which was a bad thing 30 years ago, but it's a good thing now.
Αναζωογόνηση, ανανέωση, ανάπλαση, όπως και να το πεις, τελικά το κόστος κατοικίας στο κέντρο της πόλης θα εκτοξευθεί.
The ring within about 10 kilometres of the city centre, depending on your transport mode, that's the area under the greatest pressure for gentrification.
People who we need to work and run our cities, the people who work in shops, the doctors, the nurses, the policemen, can't actually afford to live in those areas. And so suddenly they have to live further away and travel into the city. It's nice that some of these suburbs are retained and redeveloped, but a lot of the character is lost. Marrickville, Newtown, Waterloo, Redfern. As these areas become gentrified, we don't get the diversity or chaos that was in those suburbs that made them so vibrant.
Sydney's King's Cross, home to the city's entertainment quarter and one of its most popular tourist destinations. But crime and hard drugs abound here, proving a continuing source of concern for city authorities and community organizations.
Ένα τμήμα της πόλης που ενέδωσε στην αναβάθμιση αλλά και στην κάθετη ανάπτυξη ήταν η περιοχή King's Cross. Η κακόφημη περιοχή του Σίδνεϊ με τα κόκκινα φανάρια, με τις πόρνες και τους απατεώνες, τους μεθυσμένους και τους ναρκωμανείς, τους κουρασμένους, τους φτωχούς, τους απόκληρους του Σίδνεϊ.
All of this wonderful sort of ferment and turmoil was embedded in the cross, and it was a wonderful place to be. It was just exciting.
The Cross was always seen as a place where the rest of Sydney could go and let their hair down. It's a bit like Brits going to Ibiza and behaving in ways that they would never dream of behaving at home.
I'm very sorry that it became so gentrified. I actually thought that was a mistake. I think that people should have been allowed to live in apartments there, but they shouldn't have been allowed to object to the life that was already there and the culture that was already there, which was really important to Sydney. The Cross was built essentially by European bohemia in the sort of 20s. It's where sex and drugs and rock and roll arrived in Australia in the Vietnam War.
American troops were coming into Woolloomooloo and just coming straight up the hill to King's Cross, where there were an abundance of young ladies, professional and otherwise, who were happy to accommodate their needs. And they brought with them heroin. That was the big game changer there.
Πρόσφατα ήρθε να αλλάξει τα πάντα ένας νόμος που θα απαγόρευε την πρόσβαση. Ήταν απάντηση στους θανάτους 2 νεαρών που ξυλοκοπήθηκαν στο δρόμο σε 2 διαφορετικά περιστατικά.
People were just reading and hearing all the time that all these terrible things had happened in the cross, and nobody wanted to go there because they felt, well, they could be the next person. And then they changed the laws so that bars had to close earlier and you couldn't go from one bar to another after a certain time. Ironically, both of these deaths occurred early in the evening, but it was used as a reason to shut down a lot of the bars early.
I didn't think the lockout laws should be imposed anyway because it destroyed Sydney's nightlife, but I especially think that shouldn't have been imposed in the way that they were in the Cross, because in combination with the gentrification, they've really wrecked the culture without providing anything very interesting in its place.
Παρόλο που σε άλλα μέρη της πόλης παρόμοιοι νόμοι είχαν ανακληθεί, όσοι επιβλήθηκαν στη νυχτερινή ζωή του King's Cross παραμένουν σε ισχύ.
The number of incidents of serious injury caused by drunken behavior has just plummeted. But what's happened is that they've moved elsewhere. The areas that were not affected boomed.
Φημολογείται ότι οι μεταρρυθμίσεις αποδείχτηκαν επωφελείς για τους χώρους με 24ωρη άδεια, όπως το καζίνο, που υποδέχτηκε επισκέπτες από το γειτονικό Darling Harbour και τον Barangaroo, την νεότερη και πιο αμφιλεγόμενη περιοχή στο λιμάνι του Σίδνεϊ.
And here we have successive state governments, 7 premiers, giving away 22 hectares of public land, not to the highest bidder, actually to a cartel with a secret deal which still isn't public. I think Darling Harbour and Barangaroo are intense failures for Sydney, and we need to look at them and say never again. The street system is dysfunctional, and you've had, the biggest, fattest, ugliest buildings built right on the harbour. It's thrown away deep sea wharfage, which is something which we'll never build again in Sydney.
Το αρχικό, πιο κοινωνικό σχέδιο για τον Barangaroo απορρίφθηκε. Οι εργολάβοι προσπάθησαν να αυξήσουν στο έπακρο την απόδοση των επενδύσεών τους με ένα ακόμα καζίνο και μια ξενοδοχειακή μονάδα.
There's still time, but not much. Otherwise, foreshores like this will be lost forever.
Change is inevitable, and it can be good and it can be bad. And I think we all need to be vigilant to try and make sure that change is good, but of course it isn't always good. And I think also we need to measure the speed of change. When change happens quickly, it's less likely to be good.
In 30 years' time, we'll be back demolishing Darling Harbour again because it's trash urbanism. And we cannot afford trash urbanism in the 21st century. If you're going to talk about sustainability at all, you need to make long-term decisions and get them right, and you need to build for the long term, not this sort of disposable city.
Το ζήτημα της βιωσιμότητας βρίσκεται ψηλά στην ατζέντα κάθε συμβουλίου. Λόγω της κλιματικής αλλαγής θα προκαλούνται ολοένα και συχνότερα καύσωνες, πλημμύρες και πυρκαγιές.
Because of the geographical location and the make of the Sydney Basin, for the whole peri-urban fringe, bushfire is a huge risk.
The fire can shoot up many, many gullies even around the harbour in extreme circumstances, and so we absolutely are at grave risk of bushfire because of our topography and our urban form, our dispersed form. What's particularly striking is that the air quality was so damaged while the fires were actually hundreds of kilometres away.
Everything was smoke covered. You couldn't really tell if it's closer or further away.
Ο καπνός από τις φωτιές έκανε τοξική την ατμόσφαιρα και οι εισαγωγές στα νοσοκομεία της πόλης κορυφώθηκαν. Η κατάσταση επιδεινωνόταν συνεχώς λόγω του καύσωνα, καταρρίπτοντας κάθε προηγούμενο ρεκόρ με τη θερμοκρασία να φτάνει στους 48,9 βαθμούς.
It becomes really, really dangerous for people to live under these conditions.
Ακούγεται παράλογο, αλλά όσο οι πυρκαγιές απειλούν την πόλη, τόσο πιο επιτακτική γίνεται η ανάγκη για περισσότερα δέντρα.
The most important role for green space is the mitigation of heat, keeping temperatures down. This is one of the biggest problems that we see where urbanization itself causes heat because you're taking away vegetation and you're replacing it with hard infrastructure that heats cities up. contributing hugely to heat budgets within cities. And that is something we can mitigate, or try at least to lower the impacts through green infrastructure. It doesn't have to be trees, it can be any other type of open space. Blue space, that could be a lake, a creek, anything related to water. The larger the better. It cools down, particularly during those peak heat events, heat waves.
Just after Christmas in Sydney, temperature 103 in the shade. Does that make you want to emigrate? While we hurry along frozen streets, this is how they're spending their leisure time in Sydney.
The other things, of course, related to heat are transport. Once you get to a certain temperature, trains have to slow down. That means your commute is extended. Everything moves slower. You have higher stress on infrastructure, so roads become really hot. We have instances where bitumen can start to melt. Therefore, there's more stress on our road infrastructure. And that, of course, means that over time you have to put more repair work in, costing you more.
Πολύπλοκα ζητήματα που απαιτούν ουσιαστική συζήτηση και συνεργασία.
We need to build more prudently. We shouldn't be building on the fringes exposed to fire. We shouldn't be building in floodplains affected by rising waters. We need to build more intelligently, more compactly. There's a very good argument for saying Sydney should not subdivide another block on its perimeter.
So there's been a development of a vision for Sydney by an organisation called the Greater Sydney Commission. And the idea is it's all about consolidating development and population within three particular zones, described as the three cities.
So the city centre, as we know it, the historic city at Circular Quay. Parramatta is the second city, and that aspiration has been there since 1789. And then the third city, which is characterised as a parkland city, which is in the west of Sydney around the airport.
Each of them is supposed to be a 30-minute city, and the idea of a 30-minute city is that people can reach the center of each of those eastern, central, and western cities within a 30-minute travel time by public transport or walking or biking.
I think it's a great vision.
But in order for that to actually work in a real way for people, you need to have enough jobs in each of those cities that people who live in those cities can find employment in those cities.
People don't see cities as a transient place anymore, but as a place where they want to live and stay and bring up their family and have a history in it.
I think over the long run, more needs to be done to encourage this job-housing balance, but this is not a change that can occur overnight. This is something that's going to take, decades of rebalancing in order to accommodate.
We have to think about transport, food, energy. These issues need to be addressed in concert, because if you build a city like the metropolis of three cities, you need to have concepts to address these overarching issues for a working metropolis, not a struggling metropolis. Nobody wants to live in a struggling metropolis. I don't want to have a livable place. I want to have a lovable place. I want to live in a place that is lovable, where I want to put my roots down.
Αυτή η επιθυμία για μια αξιαγάπητη πόλη ταιριάζει απόλυτα στο Σίδνεϊ. Παρά τις ατέλειές του, υπάρχουν κάποια λίγα σημεία για τους φανατικούς υποστηρικτές του.
I'm a Sydney girl born and bred, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
All we have to do is understand ourselves better, and that will make us happier and make our city better. So it's kind of a pleading in a way.
If you want to really look at the optimism that Sydney should have, look at Circular Quay. It's anchored by the best infrastructure work of the 20th century and the best public work of the 20th century. And there's no excuse for not having that expectation of quality.
Wind power, solar, regenerative energy, rooftop gardens and farms that can produce food locally. We can build roads from solar panels. We can use technology that is already available to decentralize power distribution. We can do a lot of things. We just have to start doing them and do them in a concerted way. If we really want to get this metropolis right, then this is, I think, what really needs to be addressed.